Welcome back to Multimodal Interaction. The topic of this week is multimodal action. Actually, I will present this week aspects of multimodal action or interaction between humans. And this means I will focus on non-verbal aspects or non-verbal signals. The basis for my presentation and the content is actually one book, and this is Nonverbal Communication in Human Interaction by Knapp and Hall. So they have several versions of this, several editions. And here you have a screenshot of one of the books that I actually use. I will start with an introduction what actually nonverbal and verbal signals and interaction means. And after that, I will rush a little bit through different aspects of nonverbal interaction. And these you can see already in the outline are, for example, related to gaze, posture, vocal aspects, emotions, and so forth. Have a look at this little postcard from the beginning of the last century. Two people engage in a telephone conversation. But as you can see, they are not only talking verbally and acoustically, that means with words and on the acoustic channel, but they also exhibit a lot of other signals that you can perceive visually, but that is of course not transported via the telephone channel. For example, they have a certain posture, also gestures, or even facial expressions. All these kind of information, these signals, we actually produce and perceive when we are engaged in a conversation with other humans. These information are important. We sometimes consciously or subconsciously perceive them, and it's a little bit awkward if they are missing. They all contribute to our conversation. And this means they all contribute to the verbal information that we are sending and perceiving. So with verbal, I'm actually talking here about linguistic information, for example, words and sentences and so on. And nonverbal are all the other important parts. This can also be acoustic, as you can see a little bit later. Just as a small recap from the last weeks, so conversation between humans is multimodal intrinsically. So this means speech production is multimodal, as you can have seen earlier. So if we produce sounds, we also produce visual information of these sounds and so forth. But also speech perception is also multimodal. That means we use these information covered by the eyes and so on in order to make sense from all what the actual intention of the user, the message is. And having these multimodal interaction is not actually a problem for us. It's naturally. We are hardwired to do so. As a repetition, I presented earlier the Wickens cognitive resources, which show that perceiving multimodal information is actually not more difficult than perceiving unimodal ones. And you remind also this small rooster example that I have also displayed here. If we perceive multimodal information, in this case, the shouts of this animal and also the visual information of that, then the saliency in our processing is higher, and even the neural reaction of the stimuli are even higher than just presenting one modality here. It is important to note that multimodal processing is synchronized. And as I repeat from the very first session, if we produce or engaged in conversation or interaction even with machines, and the cognitive load is increasing, then we tend to prefer multimodal production. So how is the relationship between verbal and nonverbal signals? So we can, of course, produce gestures, gazes, and so on in isolation. But typically we produce them together with some verbal message, with some words and sentences and utterances. And that means there's a certain relationship between the verbal and the nonverbal signals. For example, here's a kind of approach by Scherer. Nonverbal information can be combined with verbal information by substitution. So for example, instead of uttering a certain word like yes or no, we use head movements. but they can also amplify by redundancy. That means if I say yes and really vividly nod with my head, then it will be a kind of amplification of what I'm actually telling. Of course, for some effects, for example, our irony, we can also contradict. I can say no and again nod with my head. But I can also say something like, I was fishing last weekend. I catch a really big fish. And if this is contradiction in the message that we are sending, this will also have a certain effect. But the most typical one will be a modification. And this means we have a co-joint production of information, one on the verbal channel and the other one on the non-verbal one. And this modification can be just a repetition, a redundancy, or a really certain modification of the content. And that means if I say, last weekend I was fishing and I was catching a really big or large fish, and it's the difference between having such a signal or such a signal. I have to note that there are actually two ways or two characteristics of non-verbal information. And one is that it can be produced intentionally or unintentionally. For example, some facial expressions expressing my emotion can be used by purpose or unintentionally. And then, of course, they can be unconscious. That means if I'm producing unintentionally some gestures, some gaze directions, I may be not aware that I'm actually doing this. Sometimes playing, for example, with a pen or something like this may be a good example for unintentional and unconscious nonverbal signals. Have a look at this little and quite simple communication model. You may know it already. It's a actually quite strong model and used for a lot of engineering purposes. It just means that we have a certain message. This can be verbal or non-verbal. Typically, we're talking about verbal or symbolic information here, but they don't have to be this way. And this is encoded to some kind of code. This is transmitted over a channel which may be affected by noise or some other effects, and then decoded again to finally reach the destination, the perceiver. This, of course, does not differentiate between verbal and non-verbal information. Therefore, if we really want to work on and analyze non-verbal information, we need a little bit more fitting model. And here is one. It's so-called 4 sides or 4 aspects of a message. And the main idea is that if I, as a human producing a message to communicate with other people, with my dialogue partners or interlocutors, then there are certain aspects that I can focus on or not focus on. But usually they are all present at some point or at some degree. For example, the most obvious one would be the factual information. This is something that can be expressed in the verbal content. This means the linguistic meaning of a sentence or utterance. But we also have other information that we are expressing while we engage in a conversation. One of these is the expression of myself, giving information, revealing information from my own self. This could be, for example, by voice, telling you my social or regional background that you can perceive, or my gender. Or with my clothing, I could be expressing my own assignment of my cultural social group. Also, emotions are expressed by facial expressions, by voice, or even my posture. So, for example, if I would be sad, I might have a different posture than if I'm really happy and engaged right now. Another one is the relationship aspect. And this means if you are, for example, observing 2 people engaged in a conversation, you might already guess the different roles, if there's this kind of hierarchy between the 2 people. Or whether these 2 people, the couple, is close to each other or don't know each other that well, for example, if they are familiar with each other. And there's also the last aspect, the appeal or the goal of my message. So what do I really want to achieve with this? Sometimes it is also called intention, especially when we're talking about human-computer interaction. But it may not be the same. So I like appeal as a good term here. The standard example for this one is if I tell somebody in words, I'm cold. That actually is the factual information, but my goal, my appeal is to the other, please close the window. So some of these information are verbal, mostly the factual ones. But also there are other information. I could, of course, verbally tell a person how I feel. But typically this is all already transported and produced by nonverbal information. A typical example is two people in a car at a red light stopping. And one person tells the driver when the light switches green, the lights are green. So there's a bunch of different interpretation what aspect is actually in focus here. Of course, there are factual information. The light turned on green. But there's also an appeal that could be interpreted or produced by the speaker. For example, the speaker could mean, drive, I'm in a hurry. Or it could reflect on relationship. So that I'm, as a speaker, might feel superior over the real driver and might be in the position of feeling to be in the position to tell the driver when to start driving again. So there are a lot of aspects that might be covered by such a simple phrase. As you can see, there's actually some kind of symbol here which reflects the ear and one which should illustrate a mouth. Therefore, this model or approach is sometimes called also 4 mouths, 4 ears model. The whole idea behind this is, if you reconsider the situation at the traffic light that I just mentioned, the person who speaks, who produces this kind of utterance, this kind of non-verbal information with the verbal information might have a certain focus, for example, on relationship or on the factual information. But this does not mean that the driver who is listening to this sentence is focusing on the same or hearing on the same aspect. So there can be misunderstandings. For example, if the speaker is just in a hurry and wants the driver to drive as quickly as he or she can, whereas the driver, him or herself, might be a little bit preoccupied or expecting to gain some critique here. So this could be the source of a misunderstanding and actually a fight. So why is this important for multimodal interaction with machines? I stress this because even when we are speaking with speech or voice or language with the verbal information, humans always produce non-verbal information. And of course, having a multimodal system, please remind, a multimodal system is a system that can process such kind of information even on a symbolic level and is able to refer to context as well. That means such kind of hopefully intelligent system that can make sense of the user intention and the context should also be aware of at least some of these social nonverbal signals. So, as a summary, if a human person produces a sentence, a verbal information, then it's not only relevant how it is perceived depending on the pure linguistic content, but it is also dependent on how we say it, how we look like, and how we act. There are 2 famous examples that I want to mention here. There are numerous others as well. So, for example, already the ancient Greeks knew about this and presented this as part of being a good lecturer, of being a good talker to the audience. And also there's this one nice early study by Mehrabian and Wiener from 1967, which is often cited in popular textbooks, which show that the perception of a certain word is not only dependent on the actual content, but also on who is delivering this visually and vocally. So I will not write down this infamous formula of so and so percentage of visual information or vocal information or linguistic verbal information that together comprise the whole effect on the listeners, because they don't work in real life. This is a very certain, very small study I'm talking about here. When you will find them in popular information, of course, in popular media, please don't use these exact percentages, but of course, the effect on a person, especially the social effect, is of course highly dependent on the visual and vocal information, and not necessarily only on the content, the linguistic meaning of an utterance or sentence. So as a short example, that these information, posture, mimics, facial expressions, hand gestures, gaze, are actually used and produced in human-computer interaction, in this example of an embodied conversational agent. I have a short video, which is rather old, but shows nicely some of these nonverbal information. And actually, please pay attention to the video. There is already some textual information telling you which aspect to focus on.
Oh non, tu as perdu. Ce jeu est trop difficile. Oh non, quelle horreur. Tu as perdu. Ce jeu est trop difficile. Oh non, tu as perdu. Malheureusement, tu n'as pas suivi mes conseils. Oh non, quelle horreur. Tu as perdu. Tu n'as pas suivi mes conseils.